Welcome to another Deep Dive, everybody. We're diving right in. You ready?
Always.
Okay, so today we're looking at, well, you flagged this for me, excerpts from chapter 31, Weapons of the World. And this is from the Built for God movement. Okay, so this is kind of like a Christian, spin on like the wisdom of the Tao Te Ching, aiming to, present the gospel, but in like this new way.
New expression.
They say it's to restore truth. And specifically this chapter we wanted to look at because it really tackles this idea of what it calls weapons of the world. What is that really all about?
Yeah, so, this chapter I think is really striking in just how it immediately goes after this concept of weapons. The opening lines are so powerful. Weapons are the tools of misfortune. All wise men detest them. Those who live by the Spirit of God avoid weapons of the world. Men of peace value the left side. Men of war value the right side.
Whoa, okay, right away. So many things there. It's not just saying weapons are dangerous. It's like straight up, they're bad luck.
Yeah.
Like tools of misfortune. And wise people hate them. That's pretty strong.
It is. And it's interesting how quickly it links, avoiding these weapons to a spiritual life. Those who live by the Spirit of God, avoid these things. And then, of course, we get that left side, right side thing.
Yeah. What's that all about? Beyond, just like an actual battlefield, what could these sides represent? Like different ways of dealing with problems.
I mean, we can't know for sure what the author meant exactly, but thinking about left and right, not literally, opens up some interesting stuff. Like, the left side, a lot of times associated with, the heart, intuition, maybe a little bit more yielding in a way. So maybe it's like valuing diplomacy, trying to understand the other person and, kind of not immediately being confrontational.
Right.
Whereas the right side often connected to action, logic, authority. Maybe it's about being more direct, more assertive, maybe even forceful, when dealing with problems.
Yeah, so it's almost like opposite approaches, like two ends of a spectrum.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Peace and understanding on one end, and then, maybe being more reactive or aggressive on the other.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to think about it.
And then right away, the chapter brings up those verses. It mentions 2 Corinthians 10.2-6 and Matthew 26.5-5-4. How do those passages connect with what it's saying here?
They're really important, I think, for the context. Like in 2 Corinthians, Paul's talking about how the kind of battles they're in aren't fought with physical weapons. It's spiritual warfare.
Yeah.
It's about getting rid of harmful ideas, not actual enemies.
Yeah.
Right? And it's the strong echo of what we just read, right? Those led by the Spirit, they don't use these weapons of the world.
Yeah.
And then, in Matthew, that scene where Jesus is with his disciples in Gethsemane, right? And Peter pulls a sword and Jesus is like, put that thing away. People who live by the sword are going to die by the sword. That right there, that just really hits home that violence is not the right way. It's not God's way.
Right.
And, it kind of hints at this cycle of, destruction that just keeps going when you rely on violence.
So it's saying that, weapons are inherently bad. They're opposed to living a spiritual life.
Right.
And it's grounding that in like these core Christian ideas. Okay. So then the chapter goes on to talk about this really interesting concept, like necessity, stillness, and like no rejoicing in victory.
Right.
It says, when using it out of necessity, stillness and quietude are above all, and victory is no occasion for rejoicing. Why? Why is that?
I think what's really powerful here is it's acknowledging that, there may be some extreme situations where, like, you almost have no choice but to use force. Like, it feels unavoidable. But even then, the response should be marked by, a really deep sense of solemnity, stillness and quietude, no celebrating.
That is so different from how we usually see victory portrayed, especially in war. Why do you think that is?
I think it's about understanding that even if you win, there's a cost. There's always a cost. Loss of life, destruction, the trauma that lingers. The chapter even connects this to Proverbs 24.17-18, where it says, don't be happy when your enemy falls. Don't gloat. And I think that's pointing to a much deeper thing, that shared humanity.
Yeah.
That even when we're opposed to each other, we're all affected by suffering.
It's like the victory itself is heavy because of what was lost to get there.
Exactly.
Yeah. Powerful stuff. Okay, so the chapter continues and gets into this whole danger of pride. It says, those who do not guard their lips in victory pride themselves in killing, and those who pride themselves in killing will never find fulfillment in the world.
Right. And that's a huge warning about, the allure of power how easy it is to get arrogant. The chapter's directly connecting, like bragging after you win with something much darker, right? Being proud of taking a life. And the result, it says, is you can't find real contentment. You can't find real purpose in life if that's where your pride comes from.
Yeah.
It's like you create this spiritual hole inside yourself.
It's saying that you can't find happiness in destruction.
Right.
Like those two things can't go together. There are also a couple of proverbs referenced here, 21.3031 and 13.121. How do they tie into all this?
It reminds us that no matter what humans plan, no matter how powerful they think they are, ultimately it's God who decides victory.
Yeah.
And that's a check on our ego, right?
Right.
And then Proverbs 13, that one talks a lot about being wise with your words, being careful with what you say, and how bad things come from, foolishness and violence. So the idea there is, if you're always quick to brag, to act without thinking, which leads to death and destruction, well, ultimately you're going to face the consequences.
So neither of those proverbs are saying that violence or bragging about it or being arrogant brings any lasting good.
Yep.
Okay, so we've got this picture emerging. Weapons are bad. Even if you have to use them, don't celebrate. And being proud of destruction will just make you miserable.
Right.
So then the chapter ends with these incredibly powerful thoughts about how we should view war. Listen to this. Joyful occasions are given to the left, and sad occasions are given to the right. The lieutenant general stands on the left, and the commander-in-chief stands on the right. Thus, the result of war is conducted like a funeral. The multitude of people who have been killed should be mourned with tears. This is why the victory of war is observed as a funeral.
Right. I mean, it's such powerful imagery. And it really drives home the main point of the whole chapter. It's saying that the way military leaders stand during war, the commander-in-chief on the right, which is associated with sorrow, it shows us that even when you win a war, you should mostly be feeling grief and loss.
Yeah, it flips the whole idea of a military victory on its head. Instead of triumph, it's somber, like a funeral. And it really emphasizes the sheer number of lives lost. It's demanding grief, not celebration. It also mentions a couple more verses here. Romans 12 and Matthew 5.22. What do those add to this?
Don't take revenge. Leave that to God. It's his job.
Yeah.
And I think that's emphasizing that life is sacred. You shouldn't take it because you're angry. And that's a big driver of war, right? Revenge.
Yeah.
And Matthew 5.22, this one's from the Sermon on the Mount.
Right.
And it's connecting anger and hatred to serious judgment from God. So it's showing how serious those emotions are, that often lead to violence and all that destruction. It makes sense that what comes out of that should be met with sorrow, not happiness.
So this chapter has this really strong and consistent message about how much it hates violence and how tragic war is.
Yeah.
Now it moves on to this idea of renewal, right? Through what it calls the Trinitarian method.
Yeah.
Which is mindset, aim, and practice, or MAP.
Right.
So it lays out 5 principles all based on this chapter. And it kind of organizes them according to that MAP idea.
Yep.
So let's start with that first principle under mindset. Avoiding the tools of misfortune. What's that about?
Yeah. Weapons are tools of misfortune. Yeah. So the idea here is that you have to make a choice, a mindset choice, to be peaceful and to avoid violence. Real strength, it's saying, comes from restraint, from compassion, not from being able to hurt people. It even gives you a real-world application, like be the person who tries to talk things out, who tries to find peaceful solutions to conflicts, big or small. And the verses it uses to support this are Matthew 5.9, blessed are the peacemakers, and Romans 12.1718, about living in peace with everyone.
So you're not just thinking about peace, you're actually being a peacemaker. Okay. The second mindset principle is living by the Spirit and avoiding worldly power.
Right. And that one connects back to that line, those who live by the Spirit avoid weapons of the world.
Right.
The idea here is that you have to cultivate a mindset of relying on God's wisdom and guidance.
Yeah.
Instead of trying to control things with worldly power or, trying to dominate. It's about choosing humility.
Yeah.
Choosing service over, using force to get your way.
Yeah.
It even says, like a real world application of this would be to trust in a higher plan instead of trying to manipulate things in your life. And then the scriptural references for this one are Galatians 5.16, walk by the Spirit, and Philippians 2.34, valuing others above yourself.
It's about finding strength from a different source.
Exactly.
Okay, so then the third mindset principle is humility in victory, which comes from that statement, victory is no occasion for rejoicing.
Right. So the mindset here is, even when you win, don't get a big head about it. Resist the urge to be proud or pat yourself on the back. See it as a result of grace or just circumstance, not all about you.
Right, right.
And it even says, a real world way to practice this is to just stay humble about your achievements. And don't forget to recognize everyone else who helped you along the way.
Oh, yeah.
The verses it mentions are 1 Corinthians 1.31, boast only in the Lord. And James 4.16, which is about how much God hates bragging.
I like that. It's about staying grounded even when you've accomplished something. All right, so the fourth one, mindset principle, is rejecting pride and destruction. And this links to that idea. Those who pride themselves in killing will never find fulfillment in the world.
Right. This one's really important. It's about completely rejecting the idea that there's anything good about violence. Understanding that real fulfillment, real meaning comes from fostering peace and life, not from causing harm.
Yeah.
It even suggests, in the real world, be careful how you talk and act. Promote healing and understanding, instead of celebrating violence. And the verses it uses are Matthew 26.52, about living by the sword and the consequences.
Yeah.
And John 14.27, where Jesus talks about giving his peace.
So it's not just like not enjoying destruction, it's about feeling disgusted by it.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so then the last mindset principle is viewing war and victory with reverence, which is drawn from that part where it talks about the outcome of war being like a funeral.
Right. So this principle is all about developing a mindset of deep respect and solemnity for the consequences of conflict. It even says in real life, you should mourn the loss of life that happens in current events and actively try to promote peaceful solutions.
Okay.
And the scriptural backing for this includes Isaiah 2.4, that vision of turning swords into plowshare, and Ecclesiastes 3.1-4, which talks about a time for mourning.
So basically, the whole idea of war should fill you with sadness and make you want to work for peace.
Exactly.
So this whole mindset section of renewal, it really embeds the main themes of this chapter and how we think. Lays out 5 really important ways to look at things. So now how does AIM build on that foundation?
Right. So AIM is about taking that mindset, all those ways of thinking and turning them into actual goals.
Yeah.
Directions for how you act. So the first aim is connected to avoiding those tools of misfortune. And it says you should aim for peace over power, meaning you should consciously try to find understanding and reconciliation through dialogue. It even says you should try to do this in all areas of your life,
Yeah.
personal, professional, societal. And the verses it uses to back this up are Matthew 5.9 and James 3.18, which are both about peacemaking.
Yeah. So instead of wanting to win or be in charge, you want to work towards peace.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The second aim is connected to that idea of living by the Spirit. It says you should aim to live by the Spirit, not by force.
Oh.
Meaning you should put God's guidance and spiritual principles first. Don't rely on worldly power or forcing people to do what you want. Act with integrity and compassion instead. The related scriptures are Galatians 5.16 and Romans 8 about being led by the Spirit.
Okay, it's like your goals are coming from your faith.
Right.
Okay, the third aim, building on humility and victory, it says to aim to approach victory with humility.
Right. So basically, whenever you win, don't treat it like some huge personal victory.
Yeah.
It's not about you.
Right.
It's an opportunity to serve others.
Right.
And be thankful. The verses it uses for this are 1 Corinthians 1.31 and Philippians 2.3.
I like that. It's about how you react when you succeed.
Exactly. And then the aim that's connected to rejecting pride and destruction, it says you should aim to reject pride and destruction.
Okay.
Meaning you should try to bring life and healing and restoration to the world. Don't celebrate anything that causes harm. Choose peaceful ways to solve conflicts. And the verses it uses for this are Matthew 26.52 and Romans 12.17, which tells us not to pay back evil for evil.
So it's about doing good instead of dwelling on or glorifying the bad.
Exactly. And then the last one, the aim connected to viewing war with reverence, it says you should aim to view war and victory as a tragedy.
Yeah.
Meaning you should always remember the suffering and loss that comes with war.
Right.
And work for peace. It uses Isaiah 2.4 and Ezekiel 34.16, which talks about God taking care of those who are hurt.
So basically, you always have to remember the real cost of war.
Exactly.
So AIM, it takes all those mindsets and it gives you concrete goals to work toward. Okay, so then practice, what's that all about?
Right. So practice is about, you've got the right mindset, you got your goals in place, now what? So practice gives you concrete things you can do to really live out those aims, to make them real.
Okay.
So the first practice, connected to avoiding weapons, is to practice nonviolence and the avoidance of weapons.
Okay.
Meaning, in your everyday life, Always look for peaceful solutions, no matter what. The verses for this one are Matthew 5.9 and Romans 12. And some real-world examples are, practicing patience, choosing to use words that build people up instead of tear them down, especially when you disagree.
Okay. So you're making nonviolence like a habit, a regular part of your life. What about the second practice?
The second one is about humility. Specifically, practice humility in success.
Yeah.
So basically, whenever you accomplish something, don't let it go to your head. Be grateful, stay grounded. The scriptural backing is 1 Corinthians 1.31 and Philippians 2.3. And it gives concrete examples like giving credit to others and mentoring people.
It's about how you behave when things are going well for you.
And then the third practice about guarding your words in victory. It's called practice self-restraint in times of victory.
Okay.
So it's about being careful, especially about what you say, especially publicly when you've won something.
Yeah.
Don't brag. Instead, focus on gratitude, on thanking others. The verses for this are James 3.5 about the power of the tongue and Proverbs 27.2, which tells us not to praise ourselves.
So it's all about controlling your ego when you've won.
Right. And then the fourth practice viewing conflict and war with sobriety and sorrow. So basically, you need to make a conscious effort to understand and feel for everyone who's affected by violence. And you should pray for peace and reconciliation regularly. The verses for this are Isaiah 2.4 and Romans 12 about living in peace with everyone.
So it's not just being sad about war, it's actively engaging with that pain and working for something better. What of the last one?
Right, so the last practice is about remembering that earthly power doesn't last. It's called practice recognizing the temporary nature of earthly power. So basically it's saying that your ultimate trust should be in a higher power and something eternal. And he gives the verses Matthew 6.19 about treasures in heaven and Luke 16, not being able to serve two masters.
Yeah.
And a real world example would be focusing on your spiritual growth and serving others instead of chasing worldly success and possessions.
Yeah, it's about what's truly important in the long run.
Exactly.
So we've got mindset, aim, practice, this whole MAP thing for personal renewal, all based on what we read in chapter 31.
It is.
It's not just about understanding the ideas, it's about putting them into practice in your life. Now, the last section is called respond. And this one is all about going outward, emphasizing transformation and talking to people with different viewpoints, finding common ground. It highlights what it calls universal truth.
Right. So respond is taking everything we've talked about, all those principles and practices, and saying, okay, now go engage with the world.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that this wisdom isn't just for Christians.
Oh, okay, yeah.
It echoes fundamental teachings in lots of different faiths. So for each of the 5 principles, avoiding weapons, humility, all that, it gives you similar teachings from Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism. All point to the same basic truths, finding common ground. And then it gives a real-world suggestion for how to use this to build understanding between different faiths.
Okay, let's look at some examples. So for nonviolence and the avoidance of weapons, we've got Christianity offering Matthew 5.9. Buddhism has the first precept, which says don't harm living things. And it points out that all these faiths agree that peace and the sanctity of life are super important.
Exactly. And then it suggests that you consciously practice nonviolence in your everyday life, both in what you say and what you do. Mm-hmm. Another good one is humility and success.
Okay, yeah.
Christianity gives 1 Corinthians 1.31. Islam has Surah 31.18, which warns against bragging. Buddhism says humility is one of the perfections you need to cultivate. And Hinduism includes humility as a key virtue in the Bhagavad Gita.
Oh, wow.
So they're all saying that humility is super important for balancing out pride and ego.
Yeah, that's consistent.
And for a practical application, it says acknowledge the contributions of others.
Right.
And express gratitude when you succeed.
Yeah. And the chapter does this for all 5 principles, right?
Right.
It's really interesting to see all these parallels. It even quotes St. Thomas Aquinas. It says truth cannot contradict truth.
Right, which is a powerful statement about how, at the core, there's this unity in basic wisdom. This respond section is so important because I think, at first glance, this chapter might seem like a very Christian way of looking at things. But then it goes and shows how it connects with these broader ethical and spiritual teachings that are found all over. It's saying, hey, let's have real conversations. Let's recognize that we share a lot of the same values.
Yeah.
Build bridges.
Okay, so to wrap up our deep dive into this chapter 31 of this Christian edition of the Tao Te Ching, we've seen a really powerful and consistent message. Violence is dangerous, humility is essential, and we need to look at conflict, even victory, with sorrow and reverence. And this chapter, through that MAP idea, mindset, aim, practice, It gives a very clear path for changing ourselves based on those principles. Finally, it urges us to see those principles as universal truths, things that are echoed across different spiritual traditions.
Right. It's really challenging us to rethink what we believe about power, about success, about conflict.
Yeah.
It's advocating for a more peaceful way of living and interacting with each other, with the world, a more compassionate way.
It definitely does. And, for me, and hopefully for you listening, I think it leaves us with this thought. How can you apply what we've talked about today to your own life? Avoid those tools of misfortune. Be humble in your successes. Even in victory, be thoughtful, be reflective. How can you bring those ideas into your everyday choices and interactions? How do you deal with disagreements? How do you celebrate your wins? What if you started thinking about the costs, the losses that come with any conflict, even personal ones? Would that change how you approach things? It's definitely something to think about. We really encourage you to keep exploring these themes and think about how they can help you grow and make the world around you a little more peaceful and understanding.